in the 1970s, for a Greenlander to go ice fishing out on the frozen ocean, they'd have to dig a kind of staircase down to the bottom of the ice from which they could then drill a hole into the sea. Now that you don't need to dig a staircase, you can just simply go out and the ice is maybe a foot thick. Kind of vocalizations of this interest of his back to 2019, I think, when he first put out that ridiculous tweet of a Trump Tower in nukes somewhere. And it was a bit laughable. And the way I interpreted that tweet at that time was, well, he's actually not the first American leader to ever really want Greenland, right? Kind of this fiction that Carney was pointing to did really reach its kind of apex in many ways in the Arctic. I mean, in 1987, you had the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, basically proclaim that the Arctic should be a zone of peace. This coming from a country that was a massive adversary with the US, right? And suddenly the Arctic is moving towards denuclearization in the late 80s. And then you have these international organizations that are formed, such as the Arctic Council. I mean, this is a very kind of kumbaya organization in many ways. And it worked for since 1996 up until more or less 2022.
Lemma Podcast, Jay Shapiro here, and look, it's a video not about the Epstein files, but real quick on the Epstein files, because my last two videos were sort of just rants on the topic. I have a lot more to say about it, obviously. I want to gather my thoughts a little bit better. I saw the Pam Bondi, whatever, train wreck, atrocious performance, whatever you call that. It's just sort of unbelievable where we're at with that conversation. But the last one I did, which was I dug into Steven Pinker quite a bit. I guess a lot of that stuff, the letter that he wrote for Alan Dershowitz to defend Jeffrey Epstein on this statute of sex trafficking, he regrets writing it. This is stuff that came out years ago. I just kind of missed it when it hit the news cycle the first time. I'm glad this conversation is coming back, especially in the public intellectual space and the complicity with it. So I will be talking more about that kind of stuff, but not this episode. So, if you really also want to just sort of throw up in your mouth a little bit more on that whole thing, I found, I'll put a link to it, an Alan Dershowitz appreciation night at Harvard University where Steven Pinker was on the panel and discussing, around the time that he wrote that letter, Alan came to him to see if he wanted to be a co-professor on a new course he wanted to teach. And the topic of the course, taboo. Okay, go figure. Anyway, but this is not, like I said, a video about the Epstein files. This is a video about a flashpoint potentially for global conflict that could lead to World War III. I'm sure we're all feeling a lot of that kind of stuff right now, maybe having conversations with friends about signs to look out for, whatever. And geographically, if you had to think of where this might happen, you might think of, I don't know, a conflict in the South Asia Sea, South China Sea, maybe Jerusalem, of course, always a flashpoint, somewhere in the Middle East that really spirals out of control. Of course, Ukraine, etc. But this is a candidate for that. That might be number one for me, which is this way, which is the Arctic. I frankly haven't thought about the Arctic that much. And when I picked up Mia Bennett's book, that's the researcher who I'm talking to today, I was like, wow, this is a really important place to look at and consider. And she researches it like crazy. She spends a lot of time up in the Arctic. She also studies space and the militarization of space. So this question of who owns the Arctic, what to do with the Arctic, is kind of a philosophical question of the commons, as it were. And I think a bit of a canary in the coal mine about human cooperation or the lack thereof it. So her research in this book is really cool. That was a terrible pun. I didn't mean to make it. It's a great book. Really a fascinating overview of the history of the Arctic, why it matters, when it's mattered more, etc., and how it's changing incredibly rapidly. I think probably most people have had this thought with global warming and climate change as the polar ice caps melt, that is literally uncovering, maybe trillions and trillions of dollars of value of shipping lanes, which have been impassable for millennia, suddenly becoming available, uncovering resources like deep sea oil, etc. And we're going to get into all of that. And we did have this conversation right around the time that Trump was just backing off his most recent threat of militarization and military action to go, take Greenland. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, if he'll bring that back on the table, but we do comment on that and enjoy. So if you like what I do on this channel, I've plenty of conversations, interviews, video essays, now sometimes off the cuff rants about whatever's in the news. And so keep an eye on what I'm doing. I really appreciate a like and a subscribe. And yeah, thanks. Enjoy me and Mia Bennett talking about the Arctic.
I get interested in the Arctic. Honestly, I've been interested in, I suppose, all things kind of remote since I was a kid. When I was little, I wanted to be an astronaut. I quickly realized that would not be feasible given that I'm terrible at math and things like that. So I thought, well, on planet Earth, probably the farthest I could go from home, or kind of the places that would most resemble another planet, would be the Arctic or Antarctica. So I guess, ventured more towards the north, and that also has to do with a little bit of my family heritage. So my dad's side of the family is they have Swedish speaking Finnish heritage. So I was studying Swedish when I was in high school, and I pursued that a little bit in undergrad, and that eventually led to an internship at the US Embassy in Oslo. So I did have a separate interest in political science, which was my major. So that was way back in 2008, and that year, during my internship, was the year that the US Geological Survey came to Oslo to present their circum-Arctic appraisal of oil and gas resources in the region. And so they kind of demonstrated that they'd found a lot of oil and gas in the region, and this was all coming at a time when Russia had also set its flag on the North Pole underneath the ice on the ocean bed, so on the seabed. So there was just a lot of activity happening, and it just kind of made me think a little bit more, how could I kind of start to study these issues more systematically? So then after my internship, I went back to UCLA where I was a student, and there was a professor there, Lawrence Smith, who was working on issues related to the Greenland ice sheet, Arctic shipping, and all of this. So I kind of joined his research group, and one thing led to another, and I'm still studying the Arctic, I guess. So now it feels, which is a pleasure and a privilege. So
yeah. Actually, I'll point people to your is it cryopolitics blog that you've been keeping forever, and it's you spend a lot of time in very, very, very cold places, and actually one of the questions I wanted to ask is about kind of the imagination of the Arctic in all of our heads. Is such a strange, like you said, foreign place. It feels like outer space, and I know you also study and focus on the militarization of outer space, and the photos look like an alien planet. You have these beautiful photos on your blog as well that I'll point out that are really well done. So you spend a lot of time up there. But actually, what I wanted to start with, and I think it's the second chapter in your book, is called "Where is the Arctic?" Because I think it's such like a basic, silly question, and where everyone's just like, well, that way somewhere.
yeah.
But the maps that we have and that we're used to seeing really do distort a lot where the Arctic is. So if you didn't mind, actually, I was going to share my screen, and in your appendix, you have 3 maps in your book. And I would love to have you walk me through what we're seeing on them, just to ground us of like, what are we talking about? Where are we talking about? So this is the first map in your book. And so what are we seeing here? I could kind of zoom into the legend there, but this is settlements and just sort of an overview of waterways and who lives in the Arctic. Yeah, so tell me what we're looking at here.
Exactly right. So this is a human resource and political geography map of the Arctic, and also one that illustrates sea ice melt as well. So I'm trying to show a lot at once. I'm not probably too much, but given the page limitations in the book, what I tried to do here is, first of all, demonstrate that the Arctic is an inhabited region, right? I think a lot of people forget the fact that people live there. In fact, 4 million people, many of whom are living in big modern cities, cities like Murmansk in Russia, Archangel. So Russia has the largest cities in the Arctic, and that has to do with the Soviet Union's big push to urbanize the whole Russian or Soviet North in the 20th century. So those cities still exist. Many of them have lost population, but they're still some of the biggest ones in the Arctic. You can also see that Northern Scandinavia, has a number of small settlements. Northern Scandinavia tends to be a lot more temperate than, let's say, Northern Canada, Alaska, or Greenland, due to the Gulf Stream. So there's just a history of agriculture culture, even very far north, people fishing. You have the Sami indigenous people as well, but also a longer history of colonization and settlement by let's say the kind of Norse people coming up from the south. So very much an inhabited region. One there's highways and coffee shops, and it's just I would
Hmm.
say in many ways very cosmopolitan.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, so we have kind of yeah settlements all the way up to Longyearbyen on Svalbard. I mean, this is getting to the high Arctic, so there's no trees. It's just incredibly remote. But yeah, even
Hmm.
in Longyearbyen,
Yeah.
still fairly more temperate than somewhere like northern Alaska. So there's settlement there with nice hotels and restaurants, and it's an interesting place, you could say.
Yeah.
Um, let's see, what else is worth pointing out? I mean, you can also tell that the oil and gas resources are really concentrated in the Russian Arctic, which is displayed by this
This is
dark
like
gray.
gray splotches. Yeah, over here. Yeah, 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 yeah.
So, and that also explains some of the settlements that have risen up around the West Siberian oil fields as they push farther and farther north, all the way up to you can see Yamal LNG on the map. With the
It's so hard for me to follow because I can't pronounce any of, any
oh,
of the
sorry.
names. No, no, no,
Okay.
no. I'm just like I'm looking. I'm like, yeah, it kind of looks like that word. I'm sure you run into that a lot. I don't know how you pronounce 90% of the words in your book, to be honest, because it's
Oh
all
no.
Arctic
Um,
languages. But yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah, so let's see. I don't think I can. I'm just seeing if I can access the pointer myself, but maybe
Oh
not.
no,
But
I don't think you can. Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Well, if we follow, do you see the Northern Sea route
This
hugging the,
thing.
yeah. So if you
Yeah.
were to follow it to the bottom,
Hmm.
and then towards the right, you see now, oh wait, yeah, where your cursor is, that's Yamal LNG.
Hmm.
So this is one of the biggest new development sites
I
in the
see.
Arctic.
Yeah.
About 5% of the world's liquefied natural gas now
Hmm.
comes.
Here. Yeah.
So that's really been a big motivation for Russia to develop infrastructure and keep developing shipping and various ice class
Yeah.
tankers to supply the Northern Sea route coming out of this site in the Russian Arctic.
All right, let's
Uh,
go to the second map. Unless there's more to investigate
no,
on
no,
this
no,
one,
yeah.
but yeah, yeah. Second map you did was this one, which was about language families, and this was yeah,
Right, so this one is trying to show indeed where Indigenous peoples have historically lived, their historical homelands, kind of characterized here by the languages they speak. So there's many ways you could map Indigenous presence in the Arctic, but I thought this one was a
yeah,
fairly compelling one. It's also inspired by the Arctic, I think it was the Arctic Human Development Report. There was some project by the Arctic Council that had really nice maps of Indigenous groups and their languages, and then they have shape files, which are kind of the bread and butter of cartographers. So it allowed me to easily kind of make my own
cool,
version of where they live. So you
yeah,
can see kind of all around the Arctic. It's basically
yeah.
been
It's beautiful.
inhabited
Well,
by.
one of the themes as we get into the deeper into the politics and the conversations is I obviously really like your approach to put people back in the Arctic, and this map does a huge service to that. And then your final one, which I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot about, given the rhetoric in the Arctic, is about the militarization of the Arctic. So what are we seeing here?
Right. So I think we have two maps, kind of one that's zoomed
Yeah,
out, the world from space, where we show
yeah,
the five flashpoints we talk about in the book, where we think there's a
yeah,
potential for a misunderstanding to escalate, but also you can see the buildup of different types of military assets, everything from search and rescue facilities in the Russian Arctic to a lot of places for bombers or other type of jets, let's say, to be hosted.
yeah,
We have to keep in mind that the Arctic is the shortcut between North America and Russia. So if there were a big conflict between, let's say, NATO and Russia, this would be where the planes or missiles now would kind of face off one another. And that's been true
yeah.
since before.
So
And
the five points is do you want to point them out? I have to see if I could highlight them as you do it.
right, so we could start from left, well,
Yeah,
far left to right in the bottom, we have the Russia-NATO
yeah,
borderlands.
here, yeah, yeah,
Exactly. And that's really where you see the greatest concentration of forces in the Arctic overall. So that explains the reason for the inset map below,
yeah.
which
This thing,
zoomed
yeah,
in on all those assets. And I mean, a large part of this is because Russia keeps its nuclear deterrent in the Kola Peninsula. So basically, the largest stash of nuclear weapons in Russia is right there next to Scandinavia.
Yeah,
Uh,
I
so
love the dog sled patrol icon too. Just pointing that out, I think is great. So that's number one: Russia, NATO
French
borderlands.
native borderlands, yeah, which have definitely expanded. We can talk about more of this later,
Hmm.
given that Sweden and Finland joined NATO a couple years ago now.
Right.
Then right above it, Svalbard. So Svalbard is Norwegian territory, but administered under a very kind of idiosyncratic treaty, the Svalbard Treaty, which, for instance, allows Russia and many other countries to have activities on Svalbard, not military ones, but so Norwegian territory, but Russian presence. Therefore, you could perhaps have a misunderstanding as well.
Yeah.
Above is Greenland, which
Yes.
you might want to discuss.
Yeah.
Lots going on there these days,
Yep.
but certainly the Americans have the biggest military presence, but there's also, yeah, little Danish Sirius patrol and some other kind of facilities that Denmark uses occasionally.
Yeah.
Central Arctic Ocean. This is more a flashpoint that could emerge more, let's say, in the second half of the century, but certainly one that's already opening due to receding, thinning sea ice
Yeah.
and more activity arising.
And
And
then
then Bering
Bering
Strait,
Strait.
which
Yeah.
I think is somewhat underplayed in the media lately, especially given all the attention on Greenland.
Hmm.
In fact, if we were to look at the Bering Strait, that's really where you see Russia and China starting to increase their joint activities,
Hmm.
whether it's naval kind of exercises or the Chinese Coast Guard sailing into the Arctic Ocean. The US has long had a presence as well, all the way out across the Aleutian Islands, kind of characterized by all these different facilities that the US military still operates. But certainly less attention is paid than during the Cold War by
Yeah.
the US military. I think maybe that will change. We'll see.
Amazing. Okay, so that was awesome. Thank you for that. Because yeah, what those maps did for me is it does show you in a way how crowded the
Mm,
Arctic seems to be geopolitically, and of course, as we're going to get into, with native populations that just sort of get usually erased from these geopolitical pictures. Because of that map projection, the one we all see as kids, it looks like Russia's really far away from the US and all these things because it's just physically on the map an illusion that one's over here, one's over here. But actually, when you center it on the North Pole, it actually is a fairly small-ish ocean, right? Like the Arctic Ocean is not the Pacific by any means. And so yeah, so let's now get into where we are. Obviously, the noise around Greenland is a way into this conversation, but I'm sure most people have had the thought since global warming and climate change has been on our consciousnesses for decades of like, okay, so as those ice caps melt, it's going to open up waterways and trade routes, and there is potential for massive conflict or cooperation, or it's a nightmare or disaster capital. How do you take that thought? Is this like is it a good starting place to just sort of worry about, as you said, you're thinking long term, the century or whatever it is. This is a new era that has it's been, as your book says, it's unfrozen. This has been locked for a long time, and it's getting unlocked by a man-made crisis. And are those fears warranted, or is that a good framing for the Arctic in general?
I think it's an accurate framing to a degree that climate change is making the Arctic more accessible. You also bring up, yeah, is climate change kind of creating these fears of an open Arctic? I think for many investors, let's say even many countries, they actually see a whole suite of opportunities that are arising. So for some, I'd say oftentimes for indigenous peoples, people who've known the Arctic as a very frozen place for their whole lives and for their ancestors' lives, yes, it's kind of terrifying that the ice is now incredibly thin.
Mm.
This is ice that has supported movement, transportation, hunting, things of that nature for generations, and now suddenly it's just disappeared. So you have a whole landscape that is effectively disappearing before our eyes, kind of in relatively fast motion, I would say. We could draw the comparison that, for instance, in the 1970s, for a Greenlander to go ice fishing out on the frozen ocean, they'd have to dig a kind of staircase down to the bottom of the ice from which they could then drill a hole into the sea. So that'd be about 5, 6 feet deep, right? Now that you don't need to dig a staircase, you can just simply go out and the ice is maybe a foot thick.
Mm.
So we have lost a huge amount of ice. I would say now Arctic sea ice is about 25% of what it historically has been. And that's not only due to kind of shrinkage in area, but also that thinning, right? So it's thinner, it's easier to break through. And because of that, then yes, you have opportunities for shipping, maybe for more fishing, other types of mineral activity, extraction, offshore oil and gas exploration, maybe offshore deep sea mining. So basically, there's a whole plethora of activities that are opening. And as you have more human activity, then that often does spell kind of increased risk of confrontation, maybe some increased chances for cooperation as well over, let's say, trans boundary kind of resources or transboundary environmental issues. But I think given the current geopolitical context, the fact that you have this opening ocean and countries that are increasingly adversarial and competing with one another, I think that is painting a rather grim picture for the prospects of improved cooperation in a region that is seen as having many resources available.
Yeah. I think in my emails too, I was like, I want you to assuage my fears of World War III looking like a Hoth Star Wars episode or whatever, and
Right.
I
Yeah.
and I don't know if you can because it does seem to be headed that way. Do you? I mean, is there any? This is always impossible kind of economics work to do, but is there any math or prognostication of just how much value is being uncovered by the disaster of climate change melting the caps there? Like, how much are these shipping lanes worth? So you can go. I think you talked about actually on your recent blog or a couple blogs ago, a voyage of some shipping lane that went from, I don't know where it was. You can remind me. Was it even Japan or something? It was somewhere. Yeah, China to maybe Europe,
Oh,
taking the Northern
yeah.
Passage,
Mhm.
and that's like a shortcut, a massive shortcut than going, I don't know, all the way around Africa or something, or what they used to do.
Right, yeah. So I haven't seen any systematic kind of assessments of all the resources and opportunities in the region. There was one kind of newsworthy story. I think it was by maybe was it the World Economic Forum, but they estimated that they needed $1 trillion worth of investment in infrastructure in the Arctic Ocean to unlock all the resources. I don't know how they came up with this number. I think it was a trillion. Some large number
Yeah.
that probably is not incredibly accurate because it's so hard to gauge the value of everything, right? I mean, you have and so much as I would say, not only opening due to climate change, but also at the same time, a lot of things are being closed off due to geopolitical changes. So what people might have once seen as, yeah, this short shipping shortcut between Europe and Asia via the north coast of Russia. I mean, as you mentioned, this Chinese shipping company is still using it. But a lot of European and other kind of, let's say, Western shipping companies are really kind of turning away from considering that as a viable route because it's going through Russian waters. Basically, it's kind of off limits right now. US oil and gas companies used to invest in Russia's Arctic offshore, and now they're not, right? So there's a lot of things that have been left on the table now because geopolitics have closed off those opportunities. Even if you were to talk about, let's say, the mineral opportunities in Greenland, I mean, they look good on paper sometimes, but time and again, many mines have not proven viable in the long run economically because it's just a really incredibly challenging operating environment. So there was, for instance, a ruby mine in Greenland that opened, I want to say a decade ago, and then it just shut 1 or 2 years ago because just the products they were producing were not ultimately lucrative enough. So people get excited about things in the Arctic. There's a lot of what we could call Arctic boosterism, resource boom and bust, and then things don't pan out, or the global market crashes and it's no longer viable to get resources all the way from somewhere north of 70 degrees. Right. So I think it would be hard to really tally up how much the Arctic is worth due to climate change. One, because it's hard to gauge those numbers, and two, there's all these other factors like geopolitics that are now constraining opportunities people once previously foresaw.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk geopolitics. So in your view, obviously, Trump. Well, let's talk Greenland. Why does he really want it? Why does America really say they need it? Is it minerals? Is it national security? Is like what is like, can you cut through the noise as somebody who's studied this stuff and looks closer at it than just, there's not a ton of experts on it. So I'm asking you of like, what's really going on there?
I mean, I honestly think it's just driven by Trump's obsession with real estate property, doing deals,
Yeah.
wanting to be a kind of historic president in the sense of expanding American territory by what would be the biggest growth ever. My co-author Klaus Dodds, he's called this ego politics, which I think nicely sums up what's happening. I mean, the US already has a military base there. It could build additional ones if it asked Denmark for permission. It would probably be granted the permission because the US and Denmark, since 1951, have had this agreement that allows the US to set up bases and operate them on Greenlandic territory. I don't really see an acute kind of threat to America posed by Greenland's vulnerability. There are not, as far as I understand it, increasing numbers of Russian and Chinese ships sailing around Greenland. There are in the Bering Strait, but that's really not where Trump's attention is focused. And if that were his concern, that's where he would be wanting to place more American assets. So I think ultimately, yeah, it comes down to a real estate deal. Greenland certainly does have a lot of rare earth minerals, and I've heard that, Trump is friends, let's say, with various potential investors, American investors in some of these sites. But even then, I mean, nothing is prohibiting these Americans from investing in those sites, so they don't need to acquire the whole of Greenlandic territory in order to run these mines. So I think really the only explanation that makes Trump's kind of desires to annex it somewhat sensible is that he just likes big real estate deals.
that's that's probably it's how I analyze him as well. So that's fair. So how seriously then do you take his threats, or is he just playing around with NATO and trying to push Europe around at this point? And if you could do this actually, then because you brought up 1951, to get into maybe the history of colonialization and maybe European colonialization in the Arctic, because I think like there is this kind of thumb in the eye that Trump did at those speeches to Denmark, where he pointed out, being like, who are you guys to talk to me about colonialization? Like you're Europe, and it kind of lands in this very like petty kind of way, but it's kind of true. So I don't know if you can get into the history a little bit about who owns what in the Arctic and why, or who claims what and why, and then how seriously, yeah, do you take these threats then of militarization up there?
Right. I mean, I would say that certainly Trump maybe has a point in pointing out Europe's own history of colonization. And if you look at the case of Greenland, so Denmark colonized Greenland in the 1700s formally, and decolonization only formally started after World War II in the 1950s. So at that point, Greenland stopped being a colony of Denmark and then became, I think, technically some sort of county. So now it's basically considered a kind of country within the Kingdom of Denmark alongside the Faroe Islands. But the decolonization process has been very long and fraught. There's a very kind of, let's say, tense, problematic history between the Danish authorities and how they treated Greenlanders, especially even during the decolonization process in the 50s. There were huge efforts by the Danes to kind of assimilate Greenlanders, to bring Greenlanders to Copenhagen and Denmark for kind of education, but the idea was they would lose perhaps a lot of their Inuit identity and become little Danes, as it was called. They were basically more or less forced away from small settlements into larger urban facilities where they could, or urban centers where they could better contribute to an industrial economy, right? So there's a lot of resentment that Greenlanders hold towards Denmark. At the same time, Denmark is a known entity. The relationship has improved in recent years. The current prime minister, I think, is supportive of Greenlanders' increasing move towards gaining ultimately more autonomy. So there's been two different referenda in Greenland in the 70s and more recently in the 2000s, which have granted Greenlanders increasing jurisdiction and authority over their own affairs, right? So Denmark still controls foreign affairs for Greenland, but most domestic decisions will be made by Greenlanders. by their parliament for their 57,000 odd population. So, and I think in the long run, a lot of Greenlanders do want complete independence. The kind of the deal there, though, is they would have to somehow make up for the big block grant that Denmark still issues Greenland every year. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's a large sum that is responsible for maybe about half of Greenland's public expenditures. So the idea is, okay, maybe if Greenland starts mining, that could make up for this block grant from Denmark. But then you need to kind of open yourself up to the whims of global investors who are a much less known entity than Denmark. Would that be American investors? I think now a lot of Greenlanders would be very wary of that. So, when push comes to shove, I'm not sure how those votes would take place today, given everything that's happened in the past year. Would Greenland want to become independent tomorrow? I think the current Greenlandic prime minister and his party is kind of pushing for a more measured approach towards increasing autonomy. Nothing sudden is kind of on the table. And then I guess was your kind of we were to look. Go on.
No, it's just I'm just wondering about how seriously we should take
Mm.
the threats of militarization and these bumping into each other. I suppose somewhat quite seriously. I don't know.
Yeah, that's such a good question because I don't know. I really struggle with it because I mean, we can trace Trump's kind of vocalizations of this interest of his back to 2019, I think, when he first put
Yeah.
out that ridiculous tweet of a Trump Tower in Nuke somewhere, and it was a bit laughable. And the way I interpreted that tweet at that time was, well, he's actually not the first American leader to ever really want Greenland, right? The US back to around the time of the purchase of Alaska in 1867 has actually considered trying to purchase Greenland and Iceland. It looked at doing that again in the 1940s. Denmark was not interested in selling Greenland. So it's not necessarily a new impulse, but I do think this is by far the most serious we've seen any American leader try to push this agenda. And I actually have been really surprised at how deeply it seems to be felt by the administration. There's this kind of, I guess, think tank that was set up called A New Dawn, or no, sorry, the Daybreak Foundation, and they are all interested in expanding American territory to include Greenland and I don't know, potentially even Canada. And I guess I think they are serious. I just don't know if they would actually resort to military force. I was quite worried the other week, but then Trump suddenly backtracked in
Yeah.
Davos, right? So that's what I also have trouble keeping up with is how volatile his own whims are. So is he just biding time now, or is he actually, has he moved on? I really don't have a good answer for how seriously we
Yeah.
need his threats. It's a hard one.
Yeah. So how do you, so I think like in general, is this entire field that you're interested in also in space is sort of considered frontier economics or frontier politics or whatever. How do you, just trying to play like devil's advocate, hard capitalist, which I'm not, but I can play one on the podcast if I need to. There's, what is it, 56,000 Greenlanders? Is that like the population, which is like
Yeah.
the size of like a city block in New York? It's like a small town, and they have this big territory that they're claiming. How do you maybe ethically or politically, or maybe this is a question if you think the post World War II global world order, which is certainly crumbling, how does it deal with the question of a small population and these so-called frontier obviously probably has a little bit of a stain to it because it implies empty land, and these are not entirely empty, but they are sparsely populated.
Hmm.
Um, how do you maybe personally approach the question of frontier politics of like these people ought to be the stewards of these great lands, and we should be going through them if we want or need to share the resources for a global community, or that's not exactly how it works, or not? What do you say to the capitalists being like, why should 56,000 people dictate how they're keeping all this wealth away from all of us? citizens of the world, and this just isn't fair. It's just there's so few of them, and how do you respond to kind of the hard capitalist
Hmm.
realpolitik bulldozing of these who cares about the 56,000?
Right. I mean, certainly it's a small number of people, but they know this land and these resources inside out. So if a capitalist wants to do business somewhere in the Arctic, I think for their own business prospects, they would be wise to consult the stewards of the land. I mean, this would hold true as well for Arctic explorers in the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, those who consulted indigenous people and had their kind of, let's say, I don't know, who worked with them to kind of push through some of these lands and map them and chart them with kind of indigenous, I don't want to say approval, but at least kind of awareness that these activities were taking place, usually did far better. So just because their populations are not large, I don't think they should be discounted. And maybe a kind of to reverse the tables here. Imagine if, I don't know, you're sitting in New York City and someone from Greenland shows up and tells you like what to do. It just seems like you would think they're crazy, right? So I don't
Yeah.
know, even though I understand the point about like it's David and Goliath, right? The populations are very different. But I think it's just a kind of obvious ethical wrong, but also, yeah, for your own kind of business interests. And maybe the last thing I'll add is like, I mean, there is a point that, or how do I phrase this? So for Greenland, let's say, and any other small community in the Arctic to do business with either these major countries, major corporations, there is a real question of human capital, though, in the depth
Yeah.
of that in the Arctic. I mean, Greenland has, I was at some forum where someone asked a Greenlander on stage, how are you going to deal with, let's say, there aren't really viable offshore resources, but let's say Shell wanted to come and do business. Shell probably has more employees than all of Greenland. And the Greenlander was like, "Well, we'll sit down with them. We know how to like hold them to task." But honestly, the number of Greenlanders who can do this kind of work at high levels with investors, with foreign diplomats is fairly small. And that's no reflection of the education of Greenlanders, but just the fact that they only have 57,000 people, and these people are
Mm.
overburdened as it is. So I think that's where questions of parity really do start to, I think, be a little bit concerning for Greenlanders themselves is yes, like how do they hold their own against all these countries and businesses that are now interested in their island? It's a very tiring job for
Yeah.
Greenlanders.
Yeah. There's such a strange ethical dilemma in your work, or like it's almost sometimes when I'm reading some of it, because again, you sit with these communities and you spend time with them. I think this one was, I'm going to get it wrong. It was one of the northern country cities that I can't pronounce, was getting a road all the way to the Arctic, and it was one of the first. And you were, I think, attending, or maybe you were taking photos at this, meeting with the people in the town about what to do about this project or how they think about this project. And it's like a very small community center there.
Mhm.
And, me as the ignorant reader sitting here in another part of the world thinks like, wow, this is kind of terrible that climate change is like, destroying the world, but it's bringing them this road for these selfish business interests and, to open this up. But there is this benefit to them and they're kind of excited about it. You know what I'm trying to get at? There's this strange, like, icky feeling about, we all hate climate change. We're all terrified of that it's going to destroy the planet, and it probably is. But in the meantime, there's also this like, well, some of these communities are kind of excited they're finally getting some attention and maybe some resources. How do you like? It's just, I don't even know how to like digest it, because I don't know what to do with that feeling. Like, how do these people, and you can't speak for all of them, but feel about climate change?
Mhm.
It's complicated, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I've heard so many different perspectives from people across the Arctic, as you would expect, right? Arctic people, as anywhere, have diverse opinions and diverse hopes for the future. With reference to that road project, I think maybe you're mentioning or describing the project that involved constructing a road from Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk in Canada's Northwest Territories.
That sounds right to me.
Okay.
I just skip over the words in the book, being like
Yeah,
another
it's
one I
hard to
can't
follow.
pronounce. Yeah,
I think the book's very dense at points, so I apologize for that. But
yeah.
yeah, so I mean, even like one day I was in a truck with some people driving on this road. Both of the workers were employed by the road construction project. And one of them says, oh, this is like a terrible project. It's going to destroy the land. It's, going to ruin hunting and all sorts of fishing activities for generations, right? And the other guy goes, I don't care. I put food on on the table for my family for
Mm.
5 years. So even then you have different outlooks in terms of, the value added of all this development that's coming for a variety of reasons. Um, Other people I've heard from, I've spoken to Alaska natives who are quite skeptical of climate change, or more, they say, the Arctic's always changed. We're used to this. Other people say it is changing at a pace we can't keep up with. So I would say the main takeaway is people have different views on climate change. I think most people in the Arctic would acknowledge that it's happening. They witness changes to the ice coming later, rain and snow now alternating in winter instead of just being a very consistent and predictable winter. And there's certainly worries around that, but I did see one interesting study published that showed that actually in Greenland, while more people than elsewhere in the Arctic have had firsthand experiences of climate change, a lot of them actually don't think climate change is man-made. They just think it's a phenomenon, I suppose, that's kind of happening because of natural reasons. So even then, kind of explanations around the reason for climate change will vary. But maybe a last thing to add here is I think ultimately a lot of people might view what's happening as a sort of so-called Arctic paradox. So there's a lot of opportunities opening because of climate change, but the pursuit of these activities, whether it's shipping, oil and gas extraction, mining, is only going to exacerbate climate change further. So it's a very much a Faustian bargain for communities and governments overall, I think.
Yeah. So if Trump changes his mind, or the winds change, or he wants to bury the Epstein files even more, or whatever, and he decides to invade. Wait, I don't know if that's the right word. He decides to take military action to take Greenland, whatever that is. Let's just focus on Greenland as an example. Who, if anyone, would fight back? Are we talking Russia jumping in? Are we talking NATO or Denmark being like, hey, that's ours? Like, is it China? Is this the place where the world finally bumps into each other? Can World War III start in the Arctic? Is that possible rather than Jerusalem, which seems more obvious?
Yeah, I guess this was kind of, as you mentioned, your email, like, is World War III going to have this Hoth-like appearance and start in the Arctic? I think that, I admit that I haven't thought through all these potential trajectories very carefully because I do get a lot of anxiety from considering that a war would break out over Greenland. Also because it's just something I never would have imagined even back in 2019. Then I did think Trump was just kind of being facetious in some sense. Now I see how serious he is to the point that he would not rule out using military force. And then I think, okay, now I feel a little bit calmer because of what happened at Davos, and maybe a negotiation will be reached between US, Denmark, what have you. If Trump were to invade Greenland, I don't really see World War III breaking out. I think I see NATO completely at risk of collapsing, or the US at least kind of removing itself from NATO, or the Europeans kicking the US out. I can't, I don't know. Denmark has said, some people in Denmark have said that they're willing to fight for Greenland. I'm sure Greenlanders would fight for themselves, but I don't see a wholesale armed conflict breaking out over Greenland. But then
Right.
the idea that Denmark would just sit back and lose Greenland, I don't know. It's very hard for me to get past that stage in terms of mental, I don't know, gymnastics in terms of thinking what would happen. I don't see Russia getting involved, nor China. I think actually both countries would probably be content to see NATO completely self-immolate
Right.
and without them even needing to be actively involved, right? Both countries are certainly participating in kind of, let's say, various maybe hybrid warfare, especially Russia, kind of gray zone tactics, sabotage. But I think both countries want to avoid, well, Russia wants to avoid opening a new front, and I don't see China having the appetite for a global conflict because of Greenland, right? I think China, its leaders do seem somewhat a little bit more rational than America's, at least.
Yeah, yeah. Can you share some of the stories that, like, your work, we're having sort of a geopolitical analysis conversation, but your work is really like intimately beautiful with people and cultures, and things that you witness up there. Do you mind sharing some of the more sort of like inspiring stories that surprise people about just life in the Arctic and in the North? And because there is this kind of there's a sadness to a way of life that's being threatened by all of this conversation, by all of this commerce, by all of this capitalism and geopolitics. And in your book, in your work, and in your blog, you pay homage to it really well. So I just want to make sure we make space for that as well.
Hmm. Let's see, some kind of story. Well, there's one that I recently came across, and it was actually not in the Arctic, but I was at a conference in Vienna, and there was a young woman who had traveled there from Svalbard, where she grew up, which was just, yeah, I haven't really met too many people who grew up in Svalbard, which is kind of phenomenal. So you cannot be born or die on Svalbard under the Svalbard Treaty, but she grew up there because one of her parents worked at the Svalbard satellite facility. So Svalbard actually has the world's largest kind of set of antennas that are listening to the satellites overhead because so many satellites pass over the poles. Svalbard's ended up becoming a very kind of useful spot for communicating with Earth observing satellites. So anyway, her dad had a job in this industry, which really only arose, I would say, in the late 90s in Svalbard. So it's a new economy. It's one that doesn't have a massive carbon footprint, right? It's one that has a bright future. And then she herself now is studying aerospace engineering at a university in mainland Norway and hopes to be part of a team that uh, works on a small satellite that will be launched from a new spaceport that's being built in a place called Andøya in North Norway. So you see this whole kind of new economy transpiring in the Arctic that is one that's also exciting for young people and could potentially also offer jobs that will help retain population in the North because so often young people, they don't really see an economic future in the Arctic as much as they might love where they grew up and their families, they move south for schooling and then they stay. But if there's a potential for economic development to happen in a way that is exciting, trend-setting, and allows young people to stay, I think that paints a somewhat brighter future for at least those communities in the Arctic that are tied into kind of the economies and industries of the future. So I was quite heartened by that story. And also because it was a young woman working in space, like that's pretty exciting. It goes against
Yeah.
the grain.
Yeah, well, let's then shift in the last like 15, 20-ish minutes to your work on space as well, though, because that's a huge area of focus for you. So what's the state of the militarization of space? America has its Space Force. I don't know really what's happening with the other players in the game. And it has analogies to your work in the Arctic. There's a lot of similar, again, frontier economics and ethics to deal with, and who owns space.
Definitely, right? So, I mean, we could call the Arctic the last frontier and space the final frontier, right? Of course, you mentioned these both, the concept of the frontier has these problematic connotations. One, because they portray an area as completely uninhabited. I mean, but space is uninhabited. There's been a sustained human presence in orbital Space 5 International Space Station for quite some time, but there's no indigenous population in space, right? So I think that further exacerbates this idea that space is up for grabs, that it's infinite, that people can do whatever they want there. There was, or is rather, a treaty called the Outer Space Treaty signed in 1967 during the Cold War that prohibits the militarization and weaponization of space and also of celestial bodies like the moon. But that treaty was signed at a time when governments were really only the active players in space. And over the past 20, 30 years, we've seen the rapid commercialization of space, which I don't think that treaty foresaw, and very few people in the 60s would have. But now one of the biggest players in space, for instance, is Elon Musk with his companies SpaceX and Starlink. SpaceX by far launches more than any other operator in the US. And much of what SpaceX is launching into space are Starlink satellites, which are providing global internet, which is a critical infrastructure. So you have this issue now of more and more people becoming dependent on a private entity for a critical service, which has its own vulnerabilities. But also, if we think about Elon Musk, ultimately his companies probably are aligned more or less with US security interests and their agendas too. So Starlink now has a kind of separate program called Starshield, whereby the kind of same infrastructure has been copied, but has added military uses and sensors and things like that, communication abilities. So then the question becomes, is space becoming weaponized and militarized before our very eyes in contravention of this treaty? I would say, even though we don't have, nuclear arms placed in space, certainly there's been a very latent militarization that's been going on for quite some time. The US is not the only country interested in that, but equally Russia, China. Just I think today it was announced that Germany is going to try and create its own kind of version of Starlink so that it doesn't have to be dependent, or other European countries for that matter, on infrastructure controlled by a country that I think many in Europe no longer see as a reliable ally. So certainly the kind of competition happening in space has many parallels with what's happening on Earth and in the Arctic, where you have great power competition, emerging technologies, interests in resources, whether that's specific orbits or maybe even, let's say, asteroid mining, a lot of unknowns as well, and treaties that may be up in the air.
Yeah, geez. Well, yeah. So if we could talk about Russia, then I guess to bring it back to the Arctic, and when you were talking about sort of and I really liked the answer about even to the hard capitalists, it's in your interest to talk to the local population and make friends, even if you're just trying to make money, because they'll help you, know how to navigate these incredibly difficult terrains. It seems like Russia has the upper hand there, just by your first map, that Russians have been there the longest, or there's the most of them there. Does this give them sort of the advantage in those kind of conversations, that they know what they're doing much more than some egomaniac from Queens who just likes the size of Greenland, who would probably not last 10 seconds if you dropped him out of a plane in the Arctic, where a lot of Russians would?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Russia certainly has a much deeper history of involvement in its northern regions. I mean, Russia, or let's say Russian forces, conquered the Russian landmass going out to the Pacific Ocean in the 17th century and then went over to Alaska. So just the breadth and depth of knowledge that Russians have, both through colonization and then contemporary economic activities, we could go back to the Soviet period into today, is really, I think, makes Russia a force to be reckoned with, at least in terms of, yeah, just the sheer knowledge base. I think the caveat there, though, is that Russia suffered so much in the 1990s from the Soviet collapse that it really pushed back the clock in terms of the kind of vitality of Russia's infrastructure in the Arctic with regard to whether it's military. The oil and gas frontier has continued to push north, and I think Russia does have really incredible technologies that it is using and engineering to continue to unlock resources in incredibly remote areas, like we were discussing the Yamal LNG facility. I mean, maybe Norway could be equivalent in that regard, but Russia does have, I don't want to say the upper hand, but it has a lot of expertise. Russia, though, is also willing to run a lot of risks. One, because, yeah, it lost so much during the 1990s. There's this idea that, okay, it needs to do a lot to regain its strength. So Putin has invested a lot in the North, both militarily, economically, but also Russia's willing to take shortcuts that then pose an environmental threat to the whole of the Arctic. I think just the other year, Russia, the Northern Sea Route Authority, allowed the use of non-ice class tankers to ship oil to Asia through the Northern Sea Route, when typically the authorities, even in Russia, would say, your ships need to be able to withstand encounters with ice. Here, they're willing to let it slide. So I think as Russia, I don't want to say as they get more desperate, but as they just continue to really push Arctic development to sustain their economy, to sustain the war effort in Ukraine, I think that runs the risk of a potential environmental or human catastrophe. So we'll see how far Russia's willing to go, but yeah, they know a lot in the Arctic, so.
Yeah, yeah. And then just maybe a final sort of step back of, since we've been talking space in the Arctic, but people's attentions are elsewhere. In the last couple of years, the world has really kind of shredded its trust in this global world order. I thought Carney's speech, whatever we think about Carney as in Canada, is actually a fairly historic one and will go down. I think people are not wrong to that historians will locate this one as someone saying the quiet part out loud in regards to the, I think he called it a useful fiction to kind of, this is the way I interpreted it, to kind of play along with the kind of UN international order. Like it was a useful fiction, but really we kind of all knew it was an American hegemonic system and we were going to just kind of go with this myth for a while. And now it's collapsed. And I thought it was a very honest speech to just sort of say that, and we'll see how rapidly that unwinds the sweater of this idea, this fictional thing since World War II. And I've always said sort of like just fill in the blanks of like we had World War I and it was so bad, and then we had the League of Nations to be like, oh, we're never going to do that again. We need to have a table at least to talk about, and that collapsed. And then we had World War II, and then we made the UN, and then fill in the blank. We all know what the next sentence of that is, and then what comes next. How do you, with all of your studying of the Arctic and your focus on it, it seems you've mentioned those 5 flashpoints that could trigger things. I guess just how do you, your particular lens as someone who studied this in particular, how do you view the story I just told, and what the global world order, fictional or not, whatever it has been, how that has lied to or sustained life in the Arctic or whatever it is that we're talking about there? And then how is that going to change, as I think the entire world is about to go through a rather rapid and probably violent change as these myths collapse. What's in store for the Arctic in that conversation?
Oh, that's a tough question. I mean, I think in many ways, kind of this fiction that Carney was pointing to did really reach its kind of apex in many ways in the Arctic. I mean, in 1987, you had the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, basically proclaimed that the Arctic should be a zone of peace. This
Hmm.
coming from a country that was a massive adversary with the US, right? And suddenly the Arctic is moving towards denuclearization in the late 80s, moving towards cooperation on environmental affairs, human affairs. And then you have these international organizations that are formed, such as the Arctic Council, that bring together Russia, the US, and the 6 other countries with territory north of the Arctic Circle, alongside Indigenous peoples organizations. I mean, this is a very kind of kumbaya organization in many ways, and it worked for since 1996 up until more or less 2022. But I think even before, so there was a big pause to the council's workings once Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But I think even before then, there were starting to be signs of tension, right? Russia was
Yeah.
already becoming more antagonistic under Putin. The US was showing signs of kind of withdrawing from, let's say, Paris Agreement, kind of turning its back on climate science, if not at the administrative level. Certainly, a lot of the population thinks a lot of this is baloney, right? So there's been those signs of strain, and I think now the Arctic has had earlier maybe than the rest of the world to face the fact that these organizations look quite vulnerable now. There's many people in Arctic who would say no, there's still Arctic cooperation is still happening. The region is still exceptional in that sense. We still have, for instance, Russia, China, the US, and other countries working together on Central Arctic Ocean fisheries. But these are such, I mean, I think it's a good thing, but they're very technical and narrow issues, right? So I think in the main, I'm very worried about the future of the Arctic. I mean, even the research I did as a graduate student going to Russia, that would not be feasible today. So you're
Hmm.
going to have a huge loss of people to people contacts and exchange.
Just as far as visa approvals and geopolitics making that impossible.
I mean, I could get a visa to Russia. I just don't think it'd be a great idea for me to show up in a mining town in Siberia anymore. It wasn't the best idea even in 2016, but now I don't want to risk arbitrary detention. And
Right.
the really, I think, shocking thing to me is that now my European colleagues don't want to come to America because they
Yeah.
fear they might encounter the same situation. So it's just so many schisms happening that I really worry about what will happen for the Arctic. I have Finnish colleagues who are they lose sleep over the idea that Russia might invade their country again. So
Yeah.
Finland and other Nordic countries talk about total preparedness now. It's certainly not a bright future, and I don't have a good sense of what new order will arise out of these ashes of Arctic cooperation. But I guess people in the early 1980s might not have foreseen the 90s as being an era of cooperation. So I'm not totally hopeless. Things can change dramatically, but I would agree with you that right now it does seem we're on a kind of downslide towards certainly a lot more disagreement. I hope it doesn't become violent, but there's a lot of signs of strain, I think, in the region and
Yeah. Yeah. That's excellently answered, because the big insight that, and I'll probably open in the intro with this, that I think is important for people to recognize is, as the global world order falls apart, you just described it quite well, and talking about this moment in the 80s, if the Berlin Wall falls and we have this like moment, it's interesting. The place where people actually, or these ideas, these big isms bump into each other is the Arctic. And that's something that's not obvious to a lot of people, except when you look at those maps and you're like, oh, actually just do the map this way. And you're like, that's where everyone meets on this. In theory, an alien might look at it being like, oh, that's the commons, right? There's people there, of course, right, 4 million, but it's sort of common ground where it's like, sure, there's resources, there's land, but like, can't y'all just share that thing? It's like, it's kind of in the middle. And that is a bit of the canary in the coal mine of like, no, we can't share it. We're not talking to each other anymore. And it kind of, melts down from there, to use a terrible analogy and pun that I'm sure your book has done, or while writing it, you thought of a lot of them. But yeah, that was kind of my thinking of the book, of like, this disintegrates starting in the Arctic, and
Mhm.
it flows down. So yeah, it didn't kind of assuage the fears there, but yeah, the isms that we have, let's say NATO and America splitting with it, Russia, and of course, their invasion of Ukraine, as you mentioned. There's different narratives about NATO's instigation of that and encroaching on their territories, but it all actually ties together on the top of the world at the North Pole, and that's rough. We should all be paying a lot more attention to it. And then I don't know if you have this number too, that military map we put up. There's just a whole lot of nukes under the water up there, which is just like, okay, yeah, that's not that that's not that pleasant of a thought. I mean, is there a number? Do you know? It's 1,000 Russian. I don't know how many submarines. They're all up there.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a number. I don't know the exact statistic, but the biggest nuclear concentration of nukes in the world, I think it is the Russian stronghold in the Kola Peninsula. So Russia has nuclear submarines that are docked, and Russia also has nuclear warheads
I'm
stationed on the Kola
gonna
Peninsula.
I'm gonna put our
Oh yeah.
map up again just to end with maps, since it's so cool. So which one was that peninsula?
So if you just scroll down to the bigger inset map, but at the
Ah, yeah, yeah,
second,
yeah. Okay,
yeah.
yep.
Um,
So this is Norway,
so
Sweden, Finland, Russia. Yeah, yeah, gotcha. Yeah,
right, so on the Russian side around Severomorsk,
yeah, this thing.
that's where you have nuclear submarines stationed. And then it doesn't show where the nuclear warheads are concentrated, but they're all generally in this area.
Yeah,
Um, and yeah, I was talking to a Norwegian professor who said, we were just taking the bus together one day in Tromsø, and he said, I think a lot of Nordic people have kind of deluded themselves over the past 20 years in terms of thinking that after the Soviet collapse, Russia wanted to be just like us, and they wanted to become a liberal country and westernized. And then he's like, okay, that illusion has completely disappeared, and now we're just simply faced with the fact that they have the most nukes of anyone just like positioned 500 kilometers from us, right? So there's a real vulnerability there that is only going to be compounded by the fact that I think in about 2 weeks, one of the last remaining nuclear arms reductions treaties, the START treaty, is going to expire. And that sets limitations on how many nuclear weapons can be deployed to about 1,550 or so. And so, I mean, who knows if the US or Russia will suddenly start to deploy more. But I think all of those signs point to just increasing risk of something going wrong at potentially a nuclear level, right? And
yeah,
I think there's a lot of upside on either side to start nuclear arms reduction treaties talks again, right? Like
yeah.
really worrying. Yeah.
And it seems that's where, if there's a, in quotes, like a warning shot to just project that you're willing to use one of these things, you might just fire it in the Arctic because the human toll might be a little less, but you would show your adversary like I'm crazy enough to just fire a shot across the bow up there. I don't know. I'm just like
I don't know about
projecting my
that, but
fears on you now. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if there would be something like that. I mean, maybe a tactical weapon would be used, maybe more in Ukraine or something, as has been suggested. But
Yeah.
I mean, there's certainly, I think, a chance for increasing nuclear testing once again
Yeah.
in the Arctic. I mean, like the site in the world with the second most number of nuclear tests was a Russian island, Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic, which they carried out these tests because only a small indigenous population lived there, right? So this
Yeah.
is the kind of excuse, like, oh, it's just a few people, let's just irradiate the whole place.
Yeah, yeah. And then I'll also end it with I don't want to like just be certainly I don't want to be slamming Russia here because even in your storytelling you say they're the ones being like, hey guys, let's actually do this treaty of peace.
Mhm.
Famously in the standoff with JFK and Russia, they broadcast the speech of peace in there, and so like I don't want yeah I'm in Europe now. There's a lot of anti-Russian sort
Yeah.
of sentiment and propaganda, and I think we all would do well to pause and try to educate ourselves that the gripes of countries which appear to be adversarial can be legitimate. This doesn't
Mhm.
totally I'm not apologizing for anyone here. I just want to put on the table of like let's figure this thing out. But I'll let you go. This was so cool. You're one of the very few experts in this field that is out there. And so I think you're going to be very busy in the next decade as more heads bump in the Arctic. So yeah, thank you for all of that. I learned a lot. People should grab the book. It's just like we should be looking north if we want to if we want to get a little preview. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the chance to talk about these issues, which I think are important. And yeah, the book and the Arctic more broadly is getting more attention now, for better or worse. But if the silver lining is that people learn a little bit more about this very special place, then yeah, that's at least something that comes out of all this this misery. So hopefully there's something there. But I really, yeah, appreciate the opportunity and
Yeah,
really enjoyed
absolutely.
chatting with you.